What's up, nerdy birds? Welcome to episode 58 of the Avian Behavior podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens if you've ever felt stuck or shame about a particular training procedure that seems to work for everyone, but just isn't really working for you. So if that's ever been the case for you, guess what? It has been for me. So this is the podcast for you. So by the end of this video or podcast, however you're consuming this content, there's going to be a few major training examples and programs that could really change the way that you think about some of the most basic aspects of bird behavior. And we're going to get there through a variety of different ways, some of which have nothing to do with bird behavior, but it does really impact the way that we look at science and the way that it is distributed. So hold on for the ride, and I'm really excited to give this to you. Now, science is really important for the training community, and the rigors of the academic community are just really sexy to our cause. But it can create celebrity and just like a false sense of security in the principles that just like aren't really scientifically salient. So that's what we're going to be talking about and how it could be holding you back just as it held me back for what seems like a really long time. And it was really hard to break out of. So first, in like part one, I guess, we're going to be talking about just like basic scientific principles in general and like why science changes, because this is really confusing to just everyone, not just animal people in the training community. And the reason is like science is a frontier. So there are reasons why we disagree whether coffee is good for you, red meat, red wine, tea, like all of those kinds of things like in the nutrition sciences. And there's like a reason why I'm bringing up nutrition sciences and like the medical community there is a reason. So, we'll get into that in a little bit. So it is a frontier. That is one of like what my favorite science communicators, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist, your personal astrophysicist, he is mine. So he calls it a frontier. And the reason is like, data is always getting checked. We always have like different tools that are coming out, different technologies that are coming out. And so it's always getting checked. And sometimes it's easier to do that in different like markets, different societies and different cultures than it is for others. But like what is true today just may not, like it is an objective truth for what we have, but it may not necessarily be the same tomorrow. And that's okay. We have to be okay with that. So like, for instance, like in the 1700s or before the 1700s, we didn't have telescopes. We didn't even have like a lot of the diagnostics that we had. So like, there were things that were out in the universe that we believed, but we didn't have any way of checking them. So those things were what were true for us before the 1700s were no longer true. And that's just the way that technology works. So it is important to understand like the difference between like an objective truth and what we are like now calling like, well, this is my personal truth. That's not really a thing. Like a personal truth just isn't a thing. It is a belief. There are things that are objective truths that fit into what we know about today versus like what technology can bring to us and science and research, right? These things do take time. So one of my favorite examples of this is that there's also things like corruption that that also play a factor into this. So one of the most famous examples of this is like the sugar versus fat debate. So Big Sugar was literally paying scientists to downplay the role of sugar in heart disease and some other, major like diseases for decades and shift the blame onto fat. So the New York Times did a huge piece on this in 2016, and I'm going to link that to the show notes because it sort of rocked the whole community, like everyone. This was everywhere. In another study there was a big study about how organic produce don't have the health benefits that we were under the impression of. But if you actually like dug deeper, you realized, oh, this was a study done by Stanford, but it was paid for by Monsanto, which was alive and well at the time. They've since been bought by Bayer. But it was like if you actually understand why people buy organics, they're doing it for environmental reasons, not necessarily for health benefits, but perhaps maybe those health benefits were overplayed when this study came out. That like, oh wow, we're actually like an organic apple is no healthier to you than a regular apple, but that's not really the point. So legacy media and science can play a role in shifting the conversation, but it is important to understand like where like the way that research actually works. So this is actually a really good way, a good inroad to talk about our real part one, I guess. So I really wanted to talk about why and how science can be manipulated and why it's important for you to know. And this part is not about birds. We're going to be talking about nutrition science, but I promise you there is a link because it is really fascinating. So if Brian Wansink isn't a household name to you, it is a really like maybe some of these studies are familiar if you are like in the podcast universe, like I am like entrenched in, but also there's some of these studies that came out that maybe you're familiar with. So Brian Wansink was the head of Cornell's very prestigious food psychology research unit, which is called the Food and Brand Lab. So he did like dozens of studies that showed up in the Oprah magazine and the Today Show, the New York Times. Like there was just like many of these studies that really like were kind of in the zeitgeist. So the core message of his work was it talked a lot about weight loss. So what he really looked at was just like how there was like little nudges in the environment that could make a large impact on the way that people could manage their weight loss regimens. So before I get really into it, what I want to say is where I got a lot of this information, first of all, is from BuzzFeed News expose on kind of the fallout from all of this stuff, this p-hacking business, specifically with Brian Wansink. But also where I got really interested in it was the maintenance phase episode about this, also Brian Wansink, p-hacking, Pizzagate, just kind of the science wars about all of the fallout that regarded this. So if you've heard me talk about my favorite podcast, Maintenance Phase is definitely one of those. So the tip of the iceberg was when Wansink himself was talking about the studies that came out of the Italian restaurant experiments, I guess, where he had all of this data from studies that he did at an Italian restaurant. And he was telling his grad student to just sort of keep looking at the data because he told her he's never done an interesting study where the data just came out the first time he looked at it. And he wrote this like in his blog, and scientists that saw this were like, that's not really how it works, bro. And it's true, because when you are conducting a study, you start with observations, you formulate a hypothesis, and it's really important that you design an experiment around that hypothesis. You don't formulate an hypothesis after you look at the data. And that's because of all these confounding variables that you aren't looking at and that you don't know. So these studies that came out of this specific research, they looked at the Italian restaurant, were published studies about pizza eating, and it was like claiming that consumers were claiming that higher priced food was rated higher than lower priced food. There was other studies, obviously, that didn't take place at the Italian restaurant, that moviegoers will eat stale popcorn when it's served in large proportions. This kind of, again, all goes back to the kind of the psychology of the way that we eat, that all about environmental cues that tell them to keep eating. It's really important to understand, again, that this is not how research works, okay? That he was retroactively creating hypotheses to fit the data patterns that emerged after the experiment was over, and that it takes really careful experimental design. So what ended up happening is that a lot of grad students that came away from his lab were saying that, yes, it was actually really troubling that he would look at specific areas of study that he felt would make a good story or a good article, or that would be interesting to the media. this did lead to investigations, and what really came out of it is that there are many studies that couldn't be replicated. The math was completely off, and this led to full retractions, many corrections, and he ended up losing his job. And interestingly enough, though, a lot of these ideas still live on. And that is because, first of all, they gained so much traction in the press, right? Once it's out there in the press, it's really hard to pull back from the zeitgeist. But also, a lot of these kind of seem to make sense to us. They seem to be right. And even if they aren't, it just is like, well, it's out there. On his blog, he made these comments. They raised eyebrows about p-hacking, okay? So p-hacking is the act of misusing data analysis to show patterns in data that are statistically significant when in reality they are not. This is often done by performing multiple tests on data and only focusing on the tests that return results that are significant. So we'll talk a little bit more. I'm not going to keep repeating words like p-hacking because I don't want to lose you in things like probability and statistics and things like that, because they're interesting to me, or maybe to a small set of people who are like math majors like my brother. But I promise you, it's gonna get a little bit more fascinating, I promise. So this actually led to investigations. So let's get to the controversy, okay? So this led to investigations, and they found that they just like couldn't be replicated, okay? So that is important. Like when you cannot replicate something in science, that is important. So the math was like completely off, and there was like full retractions, many corrections. He lost his job at Cornell, and yet this is the fascinating thing. You can look up those studies. They still live on, especially like once it's out there in the cultural zeitgeist again, like it's sort of there. So that leads us to a lot of things, a lot of human biases, like the anchoring bias, right? When it's like the first thing that we've heard, the first thing that we learn, we sort of just like anchor onto that, and then we move out, we sort of spread out from there. So that is, it's really hard for us to kind of relearn the right thing. So this also, again, kind of, and what it talks about in the BuzzFeed article is that there was like a so-called replication crisis that made shockwaves in some of the world's most famous psychology research. So maybe you've heard of Amy Cuddy's work suggesting that power poses cause hormonal changes that are associated with feeling powerful, like, like Supergirl. I'm doing this pose if you're watching the video on YouTube, but like, putting your hands on your hips. Deidre Staples fabricated claims that messy environments lead to discrimination. So there's a lot of those kinds of psychology research findings that just are really hard to replicate. And in an influential report in 2015, Brian Nosek, who's a psychologist at the University of Virginia, UVA, so executive director for the Center for Open Science, and his team also attempted to repeat 100 psychology experiments and reproduced less than 1/2 of the original findings. So there's a term in academia called like methodology queens, or kings, I guess, if you want to be gender fluid there. But so like being a methodology nut, let's say, is just like really kind of like when people call them like policy wonks, right? So if you remember in an earlier podcast, number 28, we mentioned the problem with methodology in Coco the gorilla and other ape sign language programs. And it's also kind of the similar issue that we have with Alex the African Gray, right? So they didn't release a lot of the tapes with Coco the gorilla, which is a problem. But basically what they were finding, and they did this with like, I think it was like Noam Chomsky, but don't quote me on that. But I know it was with some of the other ones that did sign language, where they were claiming that the apes could correctly perform sign language and that it was coherent, where they were actually just like leaving out a lot of null results that weren't really coherent parts of sign language. So for instance, like I think it was a bonobo would be like orange, 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 orange. And they were like, see, he knows orange. And it's like, well, it's not really, that's not language. He's just repeating the same thing over and over again. And it was similar with Coco, and largely ape sign language has been debunked, and yet it still lives on. Like a lot of people just keep repeating, like, look at, apes, they know sign language. Isn't our world wonderful? And it's sort of like, it doesn't make me feel great to be like, well, actually, no. And there were similar issues with Alex the African Gray, where it has never been replicated. What Dr. Irene Pepperberg found with Alex in a lab has never been replicated. Now, there are a lot of people, on the social media who are showing a lot of fascinating things with a semblance of language. I'll put that out there, using, reading or cards or symbols with their African Greys and language. But I have to say, again, going back to methodology, you have to be really careful. And science, again, like let's take it on back. Science is hard to design an experiment where you're not ruling out confounding variables. So when you're ignoring those null results and you're selecting accurate ones, it leaves an inaccurate view of what the animal actually has accomplished. And it sort of cements in pop culture what is an intellectual feat that can't honestly be replicated. So let's go back. So part 2. Let's go back to what the heck is a p-value anyway, because I just kind of like mentioned it when we talked about p-hacking. And I think I'm going to try and do this in an interesting way. I'm going to use animals. Okay. So p-hacking occurs, and I found this really interesting article that it used animals. I'm going to link a couple of articles because I was trying to be like, okay, how can I explain p-hacking to someone who doesn't care about statistics? So p-hacking occurs when researchers collect or select data or statistical analyses until non-significant results become significant. Okay, so the Embassy of Good Science says that p-hacking is also known as like data dredging, data fishing, data snooping, or data butchery, which I think are just better words for it, because an exploitation of data analysis is in order to discover patterns which would be presented as statistically significant when in reality there is no underlying effect. In other words, p-hacking is running statistical tests on a set of data until something statistically significant arises. That can be done in a few different ways. So, for example, you can stop the collection of data once you get to a probability of less than 0.05. So P does stand for probability, and it measures how likely it is that the observed differences between groups is due to chance. Current practices show in science that journals that are considered of high quality, those with high impact factors, predominantly publish statistically significant results. So researchers want to publish in such journals because it's important for their academic prestige and job, right? So there is a need as a scientist in our current society that cannot be understated. Publish or perish is the saying. And in some cases, it's not just in elite journals, right? It's also, as we see in the Lancet case, getting that viral coverage. So I just want to make sure we're putting that out there. This creates pressure on researchers and can lead to p-value hacking. So p-hacking leads to false positives, which then you get published, and it has a negative impact on future research in the field, secondary research, and systematic reviews, and human knowledge in general. So thank you, the Center for Good Science, the Embassy, I should say, for Good Science, for putting that out there, because I think that is just really, really important. So also, this allows us to inform policy, hold positions of power, create a brand, celebrity status, etc. So think about all of the ways that publishing papers and creating principles and procedures, it says something about our state of being, that we're not just publishing, but we're also, creating those viral sensations. And I'm not just talking about social media. There's legacy media as well, and just filling up the bandwidth in a community. So one of the biggest dangers of blindly relying on the probability is to determine, I should say, statistical significance, is that it does just like allow us to find the sexiest results to good p-values. So I'm not going to keep saying statistically significant, because actually it's really hard for me to say. And there are many reasons, not just because I keep fumbling over it, but I know my listenership will fall off. But just relying on the p value, like just relying on those linkages, we can establish like some really shoddy relationships. So again, like you can do some poor experimental design and you can show that like eating egg rolls is linked to dog ownership. You can show that like drinking coffee is linked to cat ownership. There's all different kinds of ways of showing these relationships that honestly are like, these correlations make no sense. So that is experimental design is really, really important. So going to animals. So let's take it back to something a little more relevant. Going to animals, there was this really interesting article talking about p hacking that talked about a particular octopus, Paul the octopus, who's a common octopus living in the Sea Life Center in Oberhausen, Germany. So he was well known for correctly guessing all 7 soccer matches Germany played during the 2010 World Cup, as well as the final match, which was between the Netherlands and Spain. So before the match was played, Paul was placed in 2 boxes, or would place 2 boxes in the tank, or the people would put these 2 boxes in his tank containing food, and each box was labeled with a different flag of the opposing countries. Okay, so then whichever box Paul chose to eat from first, that would be his prediction to the outcome to the match. So I don't know, like I've seen like George the Vulture from American Eagle Foundation. You know, he does these. It's really cute. I know World Bird Sanctuary does this. Like a lot of people, like a lot of different zoological facilities and wildlife rehab centers do this, and I think it's really cute. First of all, like, okay, let's talk about probability really fast. So he correctly predicted 8 of the 2010 World Cup games, and each time he had like a 50% chance of making the correct prediction. So he had a 1 out of 256 chance that he was going to do that. So like, was he lucky? Was he psychic? Was he just guessing? Like, what was going on? And it turns out that like, not only did he have a 1 out of 256 chance of guessing the right one, but he could also have been wrong each one of those times. So there's just an equal chance that he could have been wrong, right? Every single time. So that's also important. So like the article says in this one, there was a lot of different animals that were guessing, like sort of publicly guessing. There was a pygmy hippopotamus from Germany. There was a guinea pig. There was several parakeets, porcupines, chimpanzees, red river hogs. There's a lot going on. So why did this one octopus out of all the animals that could have made the right predictions actually make the right prediction all the time? So if those of you who are wondering if it was just luck, this is that some also believe that octopuses are drawn to horizontal shapes. So that's where Paul's decision to choose Germany, which has horizontal shapes on their flag, right? Those big block stripes, I guess. That would have made sense, except when Paul was choosing Spain versus Serbia. So as you know, if you know me, ethology matters. In the end, we know that studies are more trustworthy when they are replicated. Data scientists would try to avoid the cases like Paul's, where there is only one real case of the animal correctly predicting a bunch of World Cup matches in a row. Only when we see him doing that for multiple world tournaments are we going to start looking at the data. So I found that really interesting, right? Because a lot of people will see something and sort of just be like, oh my gosh, he actually knows what's going to happen. Maybe he is psychic. Maybe he is like, maybe this is a lucky octopus. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably are a little bit more informed than that. And I like getting through like the nitty gritty probabilities. can be a little bit challenging, but then you can ask yourself some questions. Okay, is there let's look at the ethology. Is there a reason why he might be choosing something a certain way, right? That's literally what my presentation was all about. Let's look at the ethology of this particular animal. And that's a valid point. So I always think let's go back and look at what this particular animal is doing. And I realize that's not necessarily what p hacking is all about, but it is a really interesting tie-in. And I promised you that I would get there. Okay, so part 3, are we on part 3, part 4? What does science even matter if it can be hacked and manipulated and it's always changing? Science is a way of knowing about the world that is important because we can test it and we can use evidence-based practices. And as you know, if you're listening to me at all, that you know just how important it is for replication to occur. And in animal training, sometimes that's really hard. There's so many variables that we can't always just isolate one little bitty variable and test that. But we can use evidence-based practices. So that's different to say something is science-based or research-based versus evidence-based. Now, Barbara Heinrich did a deep dive that in addition to research cited by registered dietitians and the education communities that's really useful for her work, she did a deep dive on evidence-based practices. And this is important to me because it was really generous that she shared this extra work that she did with our community that presented their abstracts for Avocet, because I really wanted this level of commitment, this level of procedural commitment to Avocet for the people that did that submitted abstracts. So that was something that I found really valuable. I will say not everyone did, but that's just the way that it goes sometimes. So it really elevated the talk with so many of our abstract presenters, and it was really special. So as Barb points out, though, the medical community also leans into evidence-based practices by necessity because treatments are so case-specific. So going back to, dietitians and the education communities, as well as the medical communities, you're looking at, you're not just looking at a recipe or a formula, and you're not just giving it straight out to every single person who walks through your door, right? Any good educator knows, any good dietitian knows, any good doctor knows that you have to look at not just the expertise that you bring to the room, not just the research that you find, but you have to look at all of the needs, the limitations, and the values that the client, the consumer, the patient, that they're bringing to you. If they're saying something like, well, my religious beliefs or my body doesn't do well with this or something along those lines, then you have to take that into consideration. So that's where really developing a specialized protocol for the people in front of you is so important. So to kind of go back there, when we say something is science-based, we could still be looping in practices like electric shocks and punishment practices, because these are technically science-based practices. They do work, right? By definition, punishment works. Electric shocks work. They are effective. But the difference between all of these is that we need to incorporate other values in as well. And that's, again, where evidence-based practices are really, really important. So the difference between evidence-based and research-based is that research-based programs were never researched in a controlled setting. So like I said, I could keep on going in on this, but I really feel like Barb's work here on her live streams, You Be the Behavior Consultant, these are really informative. And I know that they aren't available continuously. You have to either go attend the live stream or be part of our membership. So I really recommend that. So the point is not to tease apart all of these intricacies. It's to really help establish curiosity, because these parts matter, right? And to understand that there are some really important differences, and to improve the literacy in these terms. Because as it turns out, I was confronted with this head on recently, but it was also prevalent in my practice as a consultant. So it was really it really made a difference when I had to kind of turn the whole formula of procedures on its head and be like, you know what? I'm throwing everything out. I actually have to like throw away the book and not start from scratch, but really question these practices and these procedures myself. So for our behavior change programs to not just work for us, but to be presented in a way that is helpful, scientific and to be scientific and replicable is really important. So I'm not going to dive in here, but I think it's really important to say, and this is a great place to begin, is that like p-hacking, where it has sort of culled out some of our null hypotheses, our null results in lab, and led some people astray to science-based procedures, this is where I started realizing that the humane hierarchy and LIMA, least intrusive, minimally aversive procedures, just were not producing the results that I needed in order to succeed. So again, Barb did a really deep dive here, and the reason I'm going to touch on this briefly is that it's important to tease apart the science that isn't serving us or isn't replicable so that we can see the weaknesses that we're susceptible to in order to use them as a building block to stand on. So something that sounds good, especially when it was born of a pain point, like being anti-punishment. This is the kind of elixir that science-based trainers are really drawn to, right? When we see someone who's really gaining bandwidth, or like is when someone's really keeping in attention and we know that it's not good for the animals, right? But they're getting the results, and whether it's highly edited results or we're not able to see the fallout from these really, really punishing procedures later, that we want something that is going to sound better for people to work on. So I think that's where we're all really just like yearning for good science. And so that's where I want to pause first at LIMA, because again, we're talking about least intrusive, minimally aversive. And I think that, again, comes from that pain point. And intrusiveness, as Barbara talks about, is really hard to define because it's actually a label that means different things across many different communities, from like, the legal arena, right? So that's really kind of where it started. And it's often interchanged with restrictiveness, which refers to techniques that encroach upon bodily integrity or the personal space of an individual for the purposes of achieving control. So examples include like mechanical restraints or medications. And those sound good to us, right? Because like in the animal training world, when we're thinking of like restricting an animal's like liberties, or actually like mechanically restricting them, we're thinking of, we're thinking of being like that's intrusive. We're thinking of prong collars. We're thinking of restraining an animal when we don't have to. But legally, the definition of less intrusive does depend on circumstances. So there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of variables here. You can see where I'm getting kind of when we look back at our experimental design. And it's important to understand that it did come from legal terminology that was later adapted to the dog training world. So this means that our definitions aren't actually scientifically based, which is what we will need now to kind of progress beyond that, right? So a building block, as I like to say. So it did come at a good time, but now we can move on. If we're going to map LIMA onto that hierarchy, using one to guide the other, I think this is what confuses matters even more. So we're going to talk about the humane hierarchy because I'm going to show this graphic, just if you're watching the video, but I'll talk about it really quickly, just in case you're not familiar. But the first tier that we when we're looking at a behavior change program that we're trying to work on, the first thing that we do, we look at wellness, nutritional, and physical needs. The next tier, we look at our antecedent arrangements. We're looking at the environment. How can we make differences in the environment to manage behavior, to exact change? Then the next tier is positive reinforcement and counter conditioning. Then we look at differential reinforcement strategies. The next tier after that one is extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment, all as one tier. And then the final strategy that we would opt for if nothing else worked is positive punishment. So we're kind of looking at like a trial and error type of situation here as approaching behavior in this challenge. So let's say we're going to map the LIMA procedures onto it. We're going to hit a roadblock to me right when we first get to it. And the reason is that if we're looking at wellness and the animal is in pain, by some definitions, medical intervention is intrusive. It just matters who you talk to. But I would say in this day and age, in a COVID familiar world, I'm talking to a warm audience right here. It also gets really tricky when we talk about restrictiveness as a synonym. But let's get there in a second. So when we talk about intrusiveness in the medical world, let's take the example of like a bird with seasonal hormones, maybe or maybe not, right? So we have reproductive hormones, and we're stopping at that first tier. And we know that we need to assess its physical well-being. So if we take it to the vet and the vet says, okay, let's do Lupron injections or some other hormone injection treatment program. Well, if our first tier is medical intervention, and by definition that's not, is that intrusive or isn't? Because I would argue that is like changing chemical makeup of an animal is extremely intrusive. I would even go so far as to say that if we're going into pain management, long-term or short-term, that is also intrusive. And it really depends on what your comfort and what your knowledge is around pain management and what your experience is around pain management. We're talking about animal family members, animal coworkers, someone that you, even if you don't have a deep connection with, we're still changing something chemically, something biologically, something physiologically in that animal. That is intrusive. I would argue that's our first stop. So if we're talking about physical restraint as a synonym, then the problem is real, because when we get to managing the environmental antecedents, this is where I've had some real issues with this with my clients, because what actually is restrictiveness? Are we, like, if we have a dangerous bird of prey and it has full access to the mews, like, are we supposed to not tether it at all? Are we supposed to make sure that it can't hurt itself? Or what are the answers there? And I'm leaving this very open-ended because this is a case-by-case situation. You have to understand all of the ways that this actually does inform policy. So again, that's where a custom program is really important. And you could say, well, that's just one example. It's many examples. It's very, very many examples. So another example, and I'm like, this is getting real for me. Okay. Like, I'm just like, my mind is racing with these examples. So another example that I've had just recently, there's actually 3. So it just happens to be like a few African greys and like a couple of Amazons, but I could be easily talking about Goffin's cockatoos, enter any species here. Okay. So another example, these examples are a few birds that have just sort of had a lot of access to, and I'm gonna go, like, I'm not even gonna go into a lot of the variables here. So please, like, approach the variables that I am offering, or the conditions that I am offering, with generosity of spirit, that I'm trying to make this as simple as I can. But these birds, are living with, retired people. They've got a lot of access to the person's home, maybe some aviaries, also like patio aviaries. But these birds are just like pummeling the people, just like grabbing at glasses, heads, hair, neck, clothes. And their people are very concerned with the idea of restricting the bird's access to anything. And if they do, like for instance, if the bird is put into an aviary, even like an aviary where they can still see, all of the workings of the home space, or into a cage that's still like in the middle of, the living space, there's squawking, there's screaming, there's, in their words, distress, then that level of restrictiveness is not something that they're comfortable with. And so it takes really coming from me that we need to find some level, some paradigm where we can make sure that the person's needs are met, their need for safety, their need for a safe haven as well, and to also engage in their own like daily activities, because you do need that, right? And so anyway, so one of the issues with intrusiveness right here, so let's just like full stop right here. One of the issues of intrusiveness as a metric is, first of all, intrusiveness came from Stephen Lindsay's dog training book decades ago. And there was actually a really good video about it. I think it was Mike DeBruzzo, and I'll link that, where he did a full sort of rundown of where LIMA came from. Maybe I mentioned that before, but that it did come from Stephen Lindsay's book from like the 1970s. And he actually equated intrusiveness with restricting access. So for instance, restricting access, locking a dog in a room or a yard, that was considered to be intrusive by Stephen Lindsay's definition. Again, pulling that definition from, it means different things to different communities, but it did originate from the legal community. So for me, if I were to use a different metric and I were looking at environmental management and antecedent derangement, especially when I'm looking at some of these cases where these problem antecedents are really, really salient, leading to really invasive issues, right? Really problematic scenarios that just invade kind of lifestyle and create safety problems. I'm going to look at intrusive solutions because I'm going to look at their effectiveness. I'm going to look at how efficient they are, and I'm going to look at the outcomes that they provide for the bird in reducing stress for the bird and the human. Because when there's problem behaviors, there's causing stress for the bird and the human. Now, obviously, we'll talk about that towards the end, but intrusiveness and restrictiveness, for instance, are just not metrics that I would necessarily look at as viable metrics for people, because there is so much wiggle room, and you can see where the stress comes from because of that. So let's go to the third tier, because the humane hierarchy then funnels us a lot towards food as the main problem solver when we talk about positive reinforcement and counter conditioning. And you can say it all you want, like, oh no, I'm not talking about positive reinforcement, meaning that you have to use primary reinforcers. Counter conditioning, maybe, maybe not. In the dog training world, I could see where you can use affection a lot more. But as a bird trainer, especially as a free flight bird trainer, and especially if you're a raptor person, we're talking a lot about food in this tier, right? So there may be a lot of scenarios where food doesn't work, or it comes with fallout issues. Maybe it's not even an available reinforcer for you. The topography around reinforcement delivery can be just as problematic as the reinforcer itself. But also it begs the question, aren't we adding intrusiveness when we manipulate an animal's hunger levels in order to achieve motivation for a reinforcer that was previously unavailable in order to reach that closest tier, right? So if we just don't have any food motivation at all, and that does happen, believe it or not. And I've heard some trainers tell others, well, if your bird isn't motivated for food, then it's dead. But that's not really fair. That maybe you are asking the bird to, or you're needing the bird in an ambassador situation to do things that, they're not yet motivated for food, but we can get there, right? We need some more granularity in in our language, and we need some different alternatives than just using food as a reinforcer, but we can get there. It's just not the only one. So, but because we've been told, and especially, this is the dialogue that has been the defense of the humane hierarchy, is that using negative reinforcement always reinforces the avoidance response, or, calling negative reinforcement a train wreck. It's been done. But again, if positive reinforcement is that closest tier to being so valued, and then we have, in order to reach it, we have to put the animal in a state of deprivation. Aren't we looking at a more intrusive procedure than stepping back and looking at what other reinforcers we have available to us? So to me, that's where it gets confusing, because when does it say that the humane hierarchy is applicable? So here's a really popular idea that I've heard for many, many years. And this is that idea of giving the animal control over its environment, which fundamentally actually is not true, right? B.F. Skinner actually explained this very, very clearly, that it is the environment that controls the animal. But I'm not going to get into that here, because otherwise we would be speaking about this for hours. And I would love to really dive into this topic a lot more. But the interesting thing is that when you peel away the layers of what is actually going on, and this is the example that is often given, is that when you're crate training an animal, that when it looks at the door, you open the door and you're giving it control. That is not true, okay? Fundamentally, you are still in control of the door. You are creating consistent, predictable contingencies that allow it to be able to predict what will happen. But here's the interesting thing. That opening of the door is under a negative reinforcement contingency. But opening that crate door when the bird looks at it, or when the animal looks at it, you are allowing it distance away. You're removing the aversive. So that is a negative reinforcement contingency. And yet we put a label on it as control, because that's what we see. And that control is the consequence. No, the consequence is the bird gets out. The bird has space. The bird is removed from the crate. So when we actually think about negative reinforcement no longer as something that we need to shy away from, we can actually change the behavior that we put under the negative reinforcement contingency. So instead, because this is what always bothered me, because I would be told, well, eventually they won't look at the door because it's more valuable to stay in the crate. But you're offering two very valuable reinforcers, where food is going to have to be more valuable than wanting to be out of the crate. Well, again, that goes to the whole idea of which reinforcer is most valuable, and then you have to make sure that food is always the most valuable reinforcer, or wanting to go where the crate is going is always going to be more valuable. So the idea then is, if you actually accept negative reinforcement as sometimes that you can actually harness the power of negative reinforcement, you just put the ability to get out as something positive with a behavior that is positive. So instead of looking at the door and it gets to leave, you put looking away from the door and it gets to leave. And I could go on forever about this, but this is where, again, if this is what's interesting to you, let's talk about this. Let's work with this. Reach out to me, because this is what really started to change my practice and changes the practice of a lot of the people that I work with. This is the tip of the iceberg here. And so if someone is saying, well, sometimes the answer is to use negative reinforcement and that it's appropriate, how does it tell us that, right? So do we just do we skip a tier because it's too intrusive? but how do we know which is more intrusive? I don't understand. And that was a huge issue for me. I'll just say that was a huge issue for me. So if I have to choose between negative reinforcement because the bird wants me to go away, or increasing the bird's motivation through food deprivation, how am I going to know? That I think that's really important. Where does food deprivation fall in order to achieve motivation on the intrusiveness scale? And again, it obviously depends. And I feel that's a really important thing, but I think we need a different metric to guide us. And I would argue that aversiveness is not the appropriate metric to guide us. And it's easy to understand where there's a huge burden of guilt and shame that what you learned isn't working, because that was me. And I know a lot of my clients who felt that. And it just comes with a lot of untangling, and the learning and the relearning. And no one's saying that it needs to be easy, right? Like, I feel like that's really important to understand, is that if it were hard, everyone would do it. That's the whole part of learning, is that, we start somewhere and we build more skills. And that's why, there's permits and licenses and credits and all that stuff to learning something. But relearning or learning something because people need, the basics, but then having to learn it a different way, that's not the answer, right? We can learn baby science that's still the right science, and accurate science is very important. So this is why I feel so moved to talk about this, because it's also not just in reference to, how we learned the right way from the beginning, but also in reference that my story was that I started with something that made me feel a lot of shame and guilt. And that going against the grain is just not something that's natural for us. So there is the availability heuristic, which again, I talked about in my presentation in Avicet. It's also known as the availability bias. So it's a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when they're evaluating a specific topic, a concept, a method, or a decision. And this was developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Daniel Kahneman being a Nobel Prize-winning scientist in economic sciences. I've talked about this before. I've talked about Daniel Kahneman before. This is really important because, again, I talked about this in my presentation about nature and nurture informing behavior, and how our own biases blind us from the fact that we do need to be checking our own principles and beliefs. And when all we hear out there is that this procedure, this principle, this scientific methodology has been accepted here and here and here and here and here, that it's everywhere, that we just are going to assume that this is, because it's the most available one, it's the best one. And then it just sort of becomes ingrained in everything that we know. And I also used one of my favorite resources to kind of show that how hard it can be to check our own principles and beliefs. So Robert Zappolsky is a famous Stanford lecturer. He shows up on a lot of science and behavior podcasts. And a lot of his stuff is available not only in podcasts, but his lectures are available on YouTube. And he's written so many books, like best-selling books, nonfiction. And when he talks about ethology, and I even showed this in one of his most recent books called Behave, where he basically denies that free will even exists, but well, that's for another time. But when he talks about ethology, and he brings up Skinner as sort of the antithesis of ethology and behaviorism and radical environmentalism, he goes so far to go against what Skinner is talking about that he's oversimplifying to the point of misrepresenting Skinner's ideas, that ethology has no reference point in behavior, when in fact Skinner wrote about ontogeny, and one of my favorites is phylogeny, and the way that they inform training paradigms and behavior paradigms. So I highly recommend sort of I highly recommend understanding that, first of all, even a Stanford lecturer and a highly celebrated author and a great mind, and that I still value, and I still consume his resources, and I think that he's got a lot of really, really fascinating things to say. But sometimes we go so far to, I don't know if I want to say discredit, but to make sure that what we're saying is so different than the other guy that we are oversimplifying what the other guy is saying and misrepresenting their ideas and their science, right? Their methodologies. And when Skinner talked about, ethology, he was saying, like, on a basic level, just like, think about it, like on a basic level, you train a pigeon to peck and a rat to press. These are ethological building blocks. You start with that, because a pigeon is most likely to peck and a rat is most likely to press. You could train it the other way around. You could, but it just wouldn't be as easy, right? A pigeon could press with its foot and a rat could boop with its nose, but you're behind the 8 ball on that one. So when we think about that, and again, not to talk about me, but again, that is what the whole point of talking about nature and nurture is about. When we're training out our birds, what are they more or less likely to do? What reinforcers are they more or less likely to value? What are their natural punishers as well? So what do we do, right? What are we peons? What are we non-Zappolsky lecturing peons supposed to do? We want to be scientific, but most importantly, we want to be evidence-based. And our practices, they do need to involve peer-reviewed research to be evidence-based. They do need to involve taking data, okay? And that's what Sean and Massa also talked about at Avocet, and they did a really, really good job. Sean and Massa of the Constructional approach to animal welfare and training, and they did a really good job of taking data. And sometimes that sounds dense, right? Like, oh, I don't need to do an ethogram. Like, I can just watch my bird. But when you really talk about how to take data, it gets really specific and it's really helpful. And I found their approach really lovely. We're talking about, in evidence-based practice, we're talking about practitioner experience and expertise. So practical application matters. And trust me, like, this really hit home for me when I stopped working at a zoo. And not that there's anything wrong with working at a zoo, but I really started to like branch out and fly birds, for falconry and all of those different things. And again, I'm not saying that working at a zoo is narrow in experience and expertise, but there's so many things that you want to make sure that you're looking at. And when you're looking at that level, at that kind of experience as well. So understanding kind of the limitations of all of our experience, myself included, when you're looking at what you're being asked to do. And then, most important, integrating feedback from the individual case. So taking the client's needs into consideration. So when we're talking about collapsing that hierarchy, we're not saying that all contingencies are equal or balanced, right? We're not talking about anything like that. But what we're looking at is we're looking at what reinforcers are available to the animal, how much is the problem impacting the stress levels of the human and the animal in their daily lives. So when I've talked about the problem-solving paradigm, and I talked about this in a previous episode, and I talked about this, we have a course, we talked about this a lot. Sometimes it makes more sense to restrict access to problem behaviors and antecedents to minimize risks. And that can be considered intrusive, right? So going to those examples that I talked about with the African gray clients that would either attack their humans, and how can we not feel intrusive in those situations? But again, this is where giving those clients agility and movement to look at those alternatives that involve building behaviors and the language on how to do that is how we want to approach those behavioral treatments. So this language, and like I said, like Barbara talks about in her live streams, this includes, and this is where we get to it. So instead of talking about aversiveness and intrusiveness, these are the things that I look for. Are we effective? Are we efficient? And are we being optimal? And so optimal refers to looking at taking a risk-benefit analysis of minimizing harms and maximizing possible benefits. And to me, that is really, that's a really beautiful kind of encapsulation that we can do. Again, we can get scientific about it. We can look at a risk-benefit analysis. We can operationalize it. We can look at it and we can individualize it for our client, for our bird. The first thing needs to be taking into account the needs and the abilities, the needs and the abilities, and the limitations. I just smashed them all together there of the client. And some of my best consultations have had literally nothing to do with going very deep into the behavior science of things, because that's not gonna help if they really don't want to. We're just gonna like clunk up everything, right? We're gonna what's the word I'm looking for? We're going to gum up the gears. There you go. So what we talk about is we talk about giving the bird value for mutually beneficial behaviors. We're going to talk about building skills where there are a few, and we're going to talk about avoiding problem scenarios in a humane way. So you can't give someone a hierarchy and realistically expect them to know when and how it is okay to skip tiers. That is not doing the animal, the client, and scientific principles any justice. We have to evolve now to something that makes more sense. And that's where I think, again, like taking that animal in front of you, looking at what they have, what they need, where we can build, and how to minimize that stress is so valuable. The whole reason I started with WantSync and p-hacking is that science is unfortunately easy to manipulate, and we're all really susceptible to the pull of sexy results that seem to make sense, right? And the formula that has like that gorgeous like cloak of science on it is something that we're all looking for. The thing is like even Nestle knows this, and there was like this famous scandal in the 1970s where they would put their salespeople in lab coats and like nurse uniforms in third world countries and push baby formula in hospitals so that they would get new babies like hooked on baby formula, where there may not have been a need. Let's put it that way. So the whole point, though, is that science is meant to be built on, and we all have biases, and it's unrealistic and impossible not to have them. Even journalists know that they're going to approach things with a bias, but the important thing is that we need to know, what do we do with that? Like, what do we do with that? And kind of going back to that is that like LIMA and the humane hierarchy inform policy, and they are the basis of many organizations' teachings and mission statements, which means that how these organizations are structured and what information comes in and what gets left out, these are the lines that we can compare to our probability science. And it's really important that we need to know that if the humane hierarchy isn't serving our behavior change methods, how are we analyzing that? How are we computing that data? If the methods aren't replicable, then is there a clean and reliable line of feedback that allows us to amend that on a structural level? This becomes a real problem when these ideas and principles become attached to human beings. I'm not saying that the humane hierarchy was p-hacked on a systemic level. I have no idea. I don't even think it really reaches the height of research findings, right? In animal training, we don't have that level of reliability, right? We don't have that level of science yet to like say that something could be p-hacked. That's just not how animal training works. We're not at that level of rigor. Okay. What I'm saying is that I'm reporting my findings through personal experience and consulting that it wasn't working for me. And that's why I found that it is really, really important to talk about mistakes and null results, things that nothing happened. I didn't get anywhere. So I changed what I was doing. There needs to be like policy procedures around that. There also needs to be safe spaces around that where you don't just like sue someone because they said something different or said that like, hey, that actually didn't happen. Like that's just not safe, right? That doesn't do our industry any good, I don't think. So again, I just want to make it really clear, like dragging us all through the statistics, the p hacking, talking about Nim Chimpsky and Alex the African Gray. That wasn't just to just point out all that's wrong in the world. It's to point out the own flaws when we practice science without really understanding all of the rigors that it takes. Okay, so for instance, what I was saying with the Great Apes sign language studies, those practitioners, the reason why those got largely debunked was that they were prompting the sign language apes, so to speak. They were making those prompts so that the animals, they weren't actually speaking a language. They were not speaking sign language. They could make the signs, but great apes can't name things the way that we can. They cannot speak a language. So even though that still lives on with us culturally, we weren't practicing good science then. And so I do feel like that's relevant, because when I was being taught to prioritize certain quadrants over others, it made me very blind to what was actually happening in my practice, that I was using negative reinforcement, even though I didn't realize it, and that I could actually, instead of pushing that animal into a fear response, into an aggressive response, but then still positively reinforcing the responses that I was looking for, that I was focused on, that I could actually really harness the power of the multi-levels of all of the contingencies that were at play. So instead of thinking of quadrants and really dissecting what was happening, I didn't have to be so focused on compartmentalizing everything that was going on and then selecting the contingencies that I wanted to prioritize. And that's what I think that the hierarchy does, is it really makes us focus way too much on the things that we think that we should be looking for. And that's what that yield sign in the hierarchy says, is like, whoa, be careful. You don't want to use this, right? Be really, really careful. And that's what it does to us. So it is extremely important when we're moving forward and in teaching new people that we actually learn kind of from the ground up, is how to learn even the basics correctly, because then we don't have to do all of that unlearning. The point of talking about this is not that we're in some contest or science wars. It's really to underline the fact that these concepts hold a lot of power. There are people that, if there are organizations that mandate that LIMA is the law of the land, that if you do not practice LIMA and the humane hierarchy, that you cannot be part of that organization. And that is so much power. But when there is that much power, what we might be seeing a lot of also is survivorship bias, that we only hear about the instances where this is actually working, and we're not hearing about the people who are failing under this, who are struggling, who don't, and those are the people that I'm hearing from, that are not quite able to work within the confines of a hierarchy. So the other part of that is that when you are someone or an organization that does have mandates and policy, mission statements, that when that is the case, that you, the whole point of science is to not stay still. So we need to make sure that we are utilizing the best, the most highly evolved, and progressing to do so with our policies and procedures. And so that has to be the case. And again, that's the problem when they are attached to a person, because it gets really sticky when they are, right? So that's the gauntlet that we're up against when we say, like, hey, when we say, hey, this isn't working for me and I'm not sure why. Is it the science, or is it the practitioner, or the non-science, as it were? And I look forward to connecting with the kinds of people that I've been able to find who are also looking for that level of integrity in order to progress their work. if you're looking for more on this and just kind of like how I look at each individual case, there is the problem-solving paradigm. It's a paradigm. It's not a formula. And then the other thing that we do is that we have our lab, so you can check out the avianbehaviorlab.com. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.